Bible lands covers an area far larger than the 48 states of the continental United States. And that's what we have to study to properly understand biblical archaeology. Now, those who are claiming that the archaeology proves the Bible true, are you familiar with all that information? Then how can you possibly make that kind of a statement? Especially when the archaeologists don't make that kind of a statement. On page 6, Albright says, I want to emphasize the necessity of trying to keep up to date. This does not mean that anyone can actually be fully abreast of the state of knowledge in any field in a given moment, much less that such knowledge is always accurate. And in fact, Albright's interpretations of the Bible, especially the patriarchal era, has been seriously questioned now. 30 years later, Albright's interpretation himself showed his own biases, and it's been refuted, basically, or at least challenged. So much for archaeology proving things. The man knew 35 languages, man. He was phenomenal. And yet that didn't verify that his interpretation of archaeology was proof of the Bible. G. Ernest Wright again, in Biblical Archaeology Today. I've read one of his selections. I'm going to read another one because he says some interesting things in this also. This is on page 150. The well-known cases of Ai and Jericho in the Old Testament can serve as familiar examples of how archaeology makes impossible any overly simple and uncomplicated biblicism such as Werner Keller tries to produce in his book, The Bible as History. Every one of the archaeologists have said Werner Keller is simplifying things way out of proportion to what is the reality. Today, most of us take a more positive line, and there are inclined to give a tradition the benefit of the doubt unless there's evidence to the contrary. In other words, the archaeologist begins by finding a document or a situation. They give it the benefit of the doubt. That is exactly how Hugh Nibley said we should approach the Book of Mormon. The critics aren't doing it correctly. The archaeologists give the tradition, the text, the ruins, the benefit of the doubt, and they proceed from that point. That's an archaeologically bona fide methodology. It's one that the LDS scholars are using on the Book of Mormon. And we're coming up with some stunning results. There is nothing, and this is on page 151, there is nothing but negative archaeological evidence. And the origin of the tradition and the history of its transmission cannot now be discovered. This is the Joshua tradition at Jericho. The only archaeological evidence is negative. That should give us pause before saying much about what archaeology proves and disproves. Oh, and then he's talking about the various lexicons and the importance of the Hebrew and the Aramaic and the Phoenician and the the language, the Akkadian, the cuneiform, the Sumerian, the Babylonian languages. That's what I was trying to say. And he says the latest major scholarly lexicon is the Swiss scholar L. Kuhler, but it is barely an advance of its great predecessors, the German Gesenius Bull and the English-American Brown Driver Briggs lexicons of the Hebrew language of the Bible. These all need to be done afresh in light of the vast amount of biblical archaeological texts and materials that have been found. Our very understanding of the biblical languages, according to the best lexicons we have, needs to be redone and updated. They are out of date. He said that in 1968. I need to say little about the history of Israel. For here the new perspectives, and the rapidly accumulating mass of archaeological details are far better known. Here the scholarly achievement is most obvious. Even the patriarchal period is beginning to emerge from the mists of a distant past into a known setting of Near Eastern history. Yet this setting is debated, and not all are agreed as to its time or its nature. In fact, the most astonishing thing to be said about the field of biblical history is that in spite of the vast new mass of evidence which archaeology has provided, there is no starting point that can be agreed upon by the various groups of scholars. No method of extracting history from tradition that forms a consensus. So much for proof, huh? That's important to understand. That was on page 150, 154 and 155. On page 157, he says, many obscure passages in the earlier Psalms can now be understood, and new discoveries here are being made constantly. He's talking about the Psalms in the Old Testament. Now, because of archaeology, we are beginning to understand them. Didn't we understand them before 1968? Apparently not. Archaeology adds to our knowledge, but it does not prove. Archaeology changes our knowledge. This is critical to understand. And finally, on page 160, the study of the results of excavation continually opens up new fields of work and reopens facets of the old fields of work. It is difficult indeed to keep up, yet this proper study of the Bible can neglect none of it. No final answers yet. Now, this particular text is really interesting. Alfred Hurth and John McCrae, Bible Archaeology, an exploration of the history and culture of early civilizations. This is a brand new text, 2005. Very interesting texts. Archaeology in the Bible, page 10. Archaeology is especially valuable in supplying information about objects, places, and activities for which no historical data exist. Of course, that's its function. Sometimes historical records are clarified or even corrected by archaeological discoveries. Doesn't prove it, it corrects it. That's interesting. So what is the role of biblical archaeology? Page 11. As archaeology helps place biblical characters and events within the stream of extra-biblical history and geography, it answers those who would try to mythologize the Bible. But it must be recognized that it does not prove the truth of the Bible in its theological and spiritual elements. The excavation and identification of such biblical sites as Babylon, Caesarea, Corinth, Ephesus, Hazor, and Susa, these have greatly illuminated our understandings of these ancient cities and their historical settings, but this has not proved the Bible to be the Word of God. How many times have I said that? Now I have two more scholars, brand new source, biblical archaeologists, in their book, Biblical Archaeology, saying the same thing. A similar, though non-biblical, parallel would be when Heinrich Schliemann, passion to demonstrate the historical accuracy of Homer's Iliad, led him to search for Troy. He did excavate Troy, but he did not prove that the Iliad is true. Only that it is a historically accurate in its geographical placement of the site. That's all he proved. It proved none of the teachings of the Iliad. Biblical archaeology proves none of the teachings of the Bible. And aren't those the most important part of the Bible? I would argue yes. Page 16. Archaeological excavation is not an exact science, capable of producing irrefutable evidence for a given hypothesis. The argument is archaeology has proven the Bible true. That's the hypothesis. Archaeological excavation is incapable of producing irrefutable evidence for that hypothesis. Flipping over to page 42. Archaeology cannot address the question of the date of creation. That's so obvious you don't even need to say it, do you?